Welcome to this narrated PowerPoint deck. We made a commitment to present some information about how the state's school funding formula operates. I'm joined by Aaron Rausch, and we're going to talk you through the different slides in this section and then proceed into the other sections. But the first point we really want to make is that the foundation formula is, in fact, anchored in a couple of key principles. The first one, and this meshes nicely with the strategic plan, is that it's really centered on the needs of students. And you'll see throughout that we actually make a differentiation between different types of students and accommodate those realities through the funding formula. So it's one of the key attributes. The second key feature is that we distribute the funds based on certain district characteristics. And we'll talk mostly about that in this first part because a district has its own wealth, its own properties, and those have to be factored into the funding formula as well. And then finally, the big issue is this is the single largest component of the Department of Education's overall budget. This next slide, and we've shown this to the board in different settings, really shows all the different components of the funding formula. I'm not going to read all of them off to you, but suffice it to say that each one of these has its own little formula, its own little factors, and contributes to the overall amount that ultimately a district or school receives in terms of funding from the state. This next pie chart takes those different elements and actually shows you the extent to which they contribute to the overall, in this graph, fiscal year 18 funding for the formula, which is close to $8 billion. You'll notice that the opportunity grant is sort of the bread and butter of the formula. It's almost 60% of the entire amount. Followed closely by targeted assistance, which is that red pie slice in the upper right, and then the special education, which is about almost 11%, which is the green pie wedge in the lower middle there. And then all the other different pieces, you can see transportation is pretty large, as well as the funding for economically disadvantaged students. We won't go through each one of these, but it gives you a sense of that distribution. The next concept that's really important to understand is the sense that funding education in Ohio has historically and continues to be very much a shared financial responsibility. That means that some reliance is placed on local funding sources and some reliance is placed on state funding sources. And the key issue in this idea of shared financial responsibility is a sense of the local capacity, the local wealth. What is a local community able to contribute to the operation of its schools, and how does the state funding interplay with that local contribution in order to arrive at the total amount that district will have available to spend? And the next slide actually makes this point a little clearer because we use the word equalization. And here it's, in the first sentence that the formula works to equalize. And that concept of equalization is one that we often screen proposals to change the funding system by thinking through, is this proposal likely to give more money to wealthy districts or more money to poorer districts, or does it just spread money around equally? Those kinds of questions speak to the equalization, because at the end of the day, what we really need to do is, and it's a fundamental principle of school finance, is provide more state dollars to places that cannot raise local dollars of sufficient amount to fund their schools, and provide lesser amounts to those that have the capacity to raise local dollars. This next pie chart really gives you a sense of that split in the aggregate, and it's important to say in the aggregate. So you'll see that the state share in the aggregate is about 44%. The local share is 42%. Then you've got the federal government in at about 7%, and then other funding sources at another 7%. While this is the average across the state, you'll have to remember that every single district's pie chart would look somewhat different. A really poor district would have a much larger state piece of its pie. A very wealthy district might have a much larger local share of its pie. And those variations are understood to be appropriate in a system that essentially operates using an equalization kind of approach. Now, what's important, though, and what often gets debated, is somehow we have to decide how to apportion and create that amount that's the state share versus the local share. And in fact, we use in Ohio this idea of a state share index, a computed value that defines how much of the total amount that's computed that a district ought to have available to it to spend for its particular collection of students in its particular area for the particular purpose of educating these students, what part of that should the state contribute towards? That's called the state share index. And again, it has, sort of three key features to it. One is it is the tool that allows us to distinguish between higher and lower wealth districts. We also set some parameters so that the minimum state share is 5%, even if the computation would drive a lower number than that. But the maximum is also 90%, even if the computation might drive some amount higher than that. And then ultimately, it is applied to only some, but not all, of the different elements in the formula. And we'll talk about which elements those are, but it's applied to 8 of the 12 different elements in the formula. So I'm gonna turn it over to Aaron and let him talk you through the next slide. This next slide actually illustrates an example of how the different state and local shares look, and then the slide after that will give you an even more granular view of how it looks across the state.
Thanks, Paulo. So this next slide gives several examples, different types of school districts, of what their state share is in this biennium. So Columbus City Schools being the first that is listed, their state share is 59.2%, meaning that of a per pupil amount, $6,020 this year for the Opportunity Grant, we are providing them with 59.2% of that amount, and there is an implied local contribution of the difference, 40.8%. For a district like Lima City School District that under the state share calculation is considered less wealthy, to have lower capacity, their state share is 90%. And so their implied local contribution is only 10%. Conversely, Mayfield Heights, a wealthier district, their state share is only 5%. The thing that I would note is that the state share is applied to the per pupil amounts, and many of them, which we will discuss in greater detail. This is not saying that the state will pick up 59 or 90% of a school district's total spending. It says that we will apply this percentage to the per pupil amounts that are listed in state law.
And again, it's important to note that these amounts are applied to the computed value of what the state formula says a district ought to have available to it to educate students. Districts always reserve the right to vote themselves higher levels of local resources, whether it's through property taxes or the school district income tax, in order to go beyond what the state's sort of computed amounts are.
So this next slide looks at valuation per pupil by quintile. So it breaks all 610 school districts into 5 groups and then looks at the average valuation. This is from the Legislative Service Commission. And so you can see that there's a fairly large spread in valuation per pupil. So the total assessed value in each district divided by the number of students that live in each one of those districts. The average for the lowest quintile being a little less than $75,000, and the average for the highest being quite a bit larger than that, over $233,000.
It's important to put a little bit of a finer point on this graph, because the reason we talk about it per pupil is that that's how we think about all these things. The numbers that we run, the concepts that are developed, always focus on a dollar amount per pupil. So then understanding the valuation per pupil and some assumptions about how much that valuation is taxed and what that generates per pupil factors into the thinking. Hence this term valuation per pupil and how it actually plays out.
So this slide is a map with every district's value per pupil assigned to a quintile. So the districts with the darkest green have the highest valuation per pupil, more than $193,000 per pupil. And the districts with the pale yellow color, the lightest color on the map, have the lowest valuation, less than $108,000 per pupil. I think that this map illustrates that wealth isn't concentrated in just one part of the state or in a particular type of district. And this also illustrates the impact that valuation per pupil has for districts that might have high wealth but have a low number of students that reside in the district, and conversely, districts that might have a lot of wealth but who also have a lot of students who live in those districts. You can observe that districts that are seen as more rural in nature, that might surround a small city or a county seat, tend to have higher valuation per pupil than the city or the county seat that is located in the middle of those districts. You can also see in the eastern part of the state the impact that the shale and natural gas exploration has had on those districts. Generally, you can see that suburban districts that are surrounding our large metropolitan areas have higher valuation per pupil. But again, this illustrates the diversity in wealth that exists across the state. And so this next slide, to show the valuation index, or this valuation per pupil concept in a different way, looks at the convergence of valuation and income. And so income is taken into consideration in many districts in calculating what the state share index is. But this arrays the valuation index at each district, driven by the valuation per pupil, with the income index, which would be the median income of the taxpayers who live in each district in the state. You can see that the spread of valuation is fairly wide, meaning to say there's a lot of variation in the average valuation per pupil in all of the districts across the state. While there's variation in income, that the spread of income is less. So you are more likely to have similar income to a district that might be, in your backyard or across the state than you would in terms of valuation. So we use income in calculating the state share when it is less than the valuation index that is computed for a district. And so the districts that see their state share adjusted based on the lower income of the residents in their district is listed and is seen on the lower right-hand side of this graph. So the districts who receive an adjustment because of their income are all of the districts where their income is below this blue line. And so we will increase the state share for the districts that have an income index that is less than their valuation index. While they may have a lot of value in the land and buildings that are located within the school district, the income of the residents who live there may not be sufficient to afford additional property taxes. So a great example of this would be a school district with a power plant located within the district. When we look just at valuation, they are considered to be a very, very wealthy school district. But the income of the residents who live there may not be sufficient in order to generate additional local wealth.
And again, Aaron, I think you said that those are the districts that are underneath the blue line to the right of this graph, because those X's show an income level that is below the valuation index, thereby sending the message that while our valuation may look high, while it may look like we have the capacity to raise revenue, the income of the community isn't really what it is to support that. And so the state compensates with a higher state share index.
Yes.
So it's key to understand that point, because historically the focus of the state funding system has been on valuation, which causes a little bit of this frustration, saying we might have high property values or because we have a some business location or manufacturing facility or what have you. But if the income of the community is really low, you're really not doing justice to the ability of the citizens to generate the amounts of dollars that the formula might compute. And so this idea of using an income factor to adjust the assumptions for what the state share index and the state share contribution should be is what's illustrated in this graph. So on the next slide, we basically highlight the different components where the state share applies. So in other words, the opportunity grant, which as you recall is the biggest pie slice of the foundation formula, that is clearly an area that says if the state percentage of, is only 5% of your district, that applies to the opportunity grant computation. The same with special education funding. On the other hand, things like targeted assistance and economically disadvantaged funding, those are not, and the state share is not applied to those things in favor of the state providing the assistance, relatively at full strength. And we'll describe some of those factors a little bit later in other parts of this presentation. So this next slide really shows you how this set of computations plays out on average, again, given the different wealth quintiles. If you recall the graph that we saw earlier in this presentation, you saw that the valuation was really high for that fifth quintile. And as you now understand, the amount that fifth quintile actually gets from the state on average per pupil is the lowest amount because they have the capacity to generate local revenues more than the others. So this graph looks almost exactly opposite of the earlier graph. And so the lowest wealth quintile, number 1, actually receives on average $7,484 per pupil from the state. And that's because their capacity to generate resources from their property wealth and their income wealth is relatively small. And this shows the main pieces, opportunity grant. You see the list there. I'm not going to read them off to you, and the different pieces that constitute that amount. Aaron, why don't you talk through the next one?
Sure. This next slide, again, an analysis provided by the Legislative Service Commission, shows the average quintile revenue per pupil as a percentage of quintile 5. And so these green bars say that in 1991, on average, the first quintile, the lowest quintile, had less than 75% of the revenue as those in the wealthiest quintile, the highest valuation per pupil quintiles had available to them. The second quintile was just below 75%, et cetera. In the red bars, this now takes the same information and compares what is the revenue per pupil in 2015 compared to, again, the highest quintile. And so you can see that over the last decade and a half, the state has made progress in creating more interdistrict equity. And so you can see that the revenue per pupil available to the first two quintiles is now more in line with, and while still below, is more equitable and comparable to the resources that are available in that fifth quintile, that wealthiest quintile.
So the last thing we wanted to cover in this first section was just a little bit of discussion about what are the factors that influence whether a district sees an increase or decrease in the amount of state aid they receive. Because again, this is an area that gets a lot of attention, and it's only to be expected because fundamentally the formula is driven off of a number of factors, and how those factors change drives the computation. So in this next slide, we really highlight the 4 key factors. The first one is student population and demographics. If you have fewer students, and they're crunched through a formula that relies on the number of students, it's likely that formula in terms of an overall dollar amount is going to produce a lower number. And then as the state share is applied to that, that could result in lower funding from the state. The same is true if you see property valuation changes. Again, this is not an uncommon phenomenon. Property is reappraised periodically. New property, new construction is developed, and that adds to the valuation in a particular community. And so as those factors change, since those drive the computation of the state share index and the relative wealth of a particular district vis-a-vis the state average, that can also have an impact. The other factor, obviously, is the personal income of a particular district. As a district becomes wealthier and the little X moves to a different place on that graph that we showed earlier, it could have an impact on the way the state share index is computed for a particular district. And then finally, Ohio has maintained, for a variety of reasons, a system of guarantees, which basically say that even if a computed amount seems to drive a lower contribution to a district's revenues, that in fact the state would hold the district harmless and guarantee a prior year or some prior year benchmark amount to that district. At the same time, state regulations have also sometimes capped if a a district through the computation looks like it should receive a significant amount more of state resources, sometimes a cap is put into place to smooth out the increases and guarantees smooth out the decreases that a district might otherwise experience. Just to illustrate a couple of these points, this first map really shows the changes in the total ADM, in other words, the total student populations over the time period fiscal year 11 to 16. You can see, I think everybody knows the population in Ohio is not growing like some of our, southern state colleagues. We are seeing lower numbers, and that bears out in this map. You see a lot of red, which is, everywhere from dark red, which is 10% or less, to different values of fewer and fewer students, and only a few places where you see any green, where you see increases in students. And the reality is when you have fewer students, the actual educational challenge is lessened. And there is a sense that it should not cost as much to educate those students, although we recognize that it takes time to adjust and right-size an educating organization to accommodate the fact that there may be fewer students. This other map is in some ways the converse. And maybe, Aaron, I'll ask you to talk through the different gradations on this one.
Sure. This looks at the change in property values between tax years 11 and 16, so generally the same time period as the change in student population in ADM. And so you can see that generally property values in the state have increased during that time period. There are parts of the state that have seen their property values decline over that time period. And again, since valuation and valuation per pupil is such a driver in the computation of the state share index and the formula, this has a large impact in determining the state share of each district and the likelihood of seeing increased or decreased revenues. You can observe that while rural areas of the state have seen their property values increase, a lot of that tied to shale natural gas exploration and agricultural values increasing over the last several years. Cities, small towns, small cities in Ohio have actually seen their property values decline over that same time period. And so because the state share is relational in nature, the valuation changes that happen in your school district and your town also impact the changes relative to the changes in valuation in every other school district in the state.
So that essentially concludes this part one. Join us for part two, where we'll get into a little more detail about the funding formula elements.